President Obama was confronted with multiple crises as he entered office, not to mention a series of violent tragedies and racially charged incidents that took place on his watch, including the death of Roland Martin. Then you talk about Freddie Gray, you talk about Mike Brown, you talk about Eric Garner, Aiyana Jones, you talk about Rekia Boyd. You can go on and on and on. This presidency will also be defined by the rise of Black Lives Matter. Let's go back to our panel on this. When you talk about criminal justice reform, look, Attorney General Eric Holder played a critical role changing the rules when it came to prosecutions, saying, look, you're not going to get promoted, or your promotion is not going to be based upon how many more people you get put in jail for how long. That was critical. Then you talk about, again, with the president, Angela, as you mentioned earlier, how he used commutations more than any other president. How do we assess this president's legacy when it comes to criminal justice reform and also dealing with police issues such as police brutality, and then weaving in Black Lives Matter?
I mean, look, there was also an increase in consent decrees. After some consistent complaining, he actually did change the law so that you don't have a bunch of Mayberry cops in Ferguson getting access to military hardware every 15 minutes. There were some things that he did that were substantive improvements. There were things that he looked at that no other president had cared about before. Not only sort of with the Gulf War equipment, the consent decrees, that was major. Clinton had come up with consent decrees in the 90s, and Bush had hardly ever used them at all. And the fact that they were trying to rush some in at the last couple of minutes in cities like Baltimore, that was an improvement. That was something that I was particularly impressed with when it comes to Obama.
Lauren, on this whole issue, when you talk about what Greg mentioned earlier, the President Roosevelt comment to A. Philip Randolph, Philip, make me do it. You saw that even with Black Lives Matter. When he met with many of those leaders, they sat in the Oval Office and challenged this president. They were not just enamored with being in the Oval Office, but he also early on caught the wrath of white America when he was asked a question at a news conference, and it was this question here, folks, dealing with the issue of Skip Gates being arrested by Cambridge, Massachusetts police.
I don't know, not having been there and not seeing all the facts, what role race played in that. But I think it's fair to say, number one, any of us would be pretty angry. Number two, that the Cambridge police acted stupidly in arresting somebody when there was already proof that they were in their own home.
So, Lauren, on that particular point there, that was an example of the president speaking honestly about race, about police issues, and white America. Oh my God, the backlash was real.
Right. Yeah, obviously being the first black president of the United States, he's had to deal with these issues of trying to balance both sides for his entire presidency. I happen to think in the first few years he really sort of overcommitted to the side of trying to be too cautious. The Skip Gates thing was an unfortunate example of that, but he got better as he went along. Unfortunately, it shouldn't have taken 9 people getting murdered in South Carolina for that to get better. Because there's some obvious statements of fact that needed to happen, but it was good to see the advocacy, the acceptance of the young advocates into the White House. That had not happened before. I think the White House should be commended for having them in because, usually it's the same, they were sort of going through the motions in the first 3 years. They would have Sharpton, Morial, and Ben Jealous, and okay, we'll have the black meeting, and then that was about it. And then they really did have some more acceptance of the younger leaders as they went on.
Yeah. Angela, we also saw a significant change in federal judiciary, and that is the appointments he made in terms of those judgeships, but he also got criticized when it came to the Supreme Court, not interviewing any black women. He made 3 appointments, 2 of them were actually confirmed. I was extremely critical here, saying appoint a black woman. Yes. When Scalia died. I felt that could have put a level of pressure on the senators. Absolutely. Where they could have potentially even had the actual confirmation hearing. Right. Putting up Merrick Garland did nothing. That also could have actually, and still in my opinion, fired up younger voters in anticipation of the election as well. And so when you also weave in that also is an important part of the legacy, the federal bench.
No, there's no question about it. I think, again, this contrast is, I think it really does demonstrate the challenges that we experienced in both supporting and loving our president and cheering for him and also having to challenge him. So when I think about this Supreme Court moment, this is one of the most infuriating for me. I was devastated by that. I was frustrated by that.
And black leadership, Angela, were way too silent and they acquiesced.
I was more livid with black leadership and civil rights organizations than I was with the president, because if we do have an obligation to make him do it, you don't have an obligation to tweet support for Merrick Garland, whom many of us had never even heard of. Right. I think the bigger issue for me is you contrast that with where you started, Trayvon Martin, and him finally getting to the point where he goes to the Rose Garden and says, Trayvon Martin could have been me.
Okay, let me give y'all some insight, okay, because this had not been revealed. That morning, the Time Journal Morning Show, we discussed it. Y'all might remember that weekend they had all of those candlelight vigils, and it was hoodie up on Sunday. I called the White House, and I talked to Valerie Jarrett, and I said, y'all about to get left behind. I said, y'all better come out and say something. They said, well, we don't really want to get involved in this whole deal because of, of this whole issue in terms of there's an investigation. I said, no, you're about to get left behind by Black America, and y'all better get on it.
And
I got a call 2 hours later, said, be sure to watch the news conference in the Rose Garden.
There were several conversations like that, and I think my only point here is you contrast that very important moment, and did you bring up the Charleston?
Yeah,
so
Lauren did.
When you think about that and you think about that amazing grace moment, and then you contrast that with the Supreme Court, I mean, we literally are going through these constant
symbolism issue there, though. It's always symbols over substance.
Greg,
but I don't think it's fair to say there's no substance.
The judicial appointments are historic. He has appointed more black judges than anybody, but you're right, the Merrick Garland thing was extremely angering.
20 years from now, forget Elena Kagan. I mean, I do this with my students over at Howard Law. 20 years from now, we may be looking at Sonia Sotomayor as one of the most important things he did as it relates to the law. Depending on, because Sonia Sotomayor has not shrunk. In fact, the first place she visited after her appointment was Howard Law School, and she's been over there several times. She really is remarkable. And even though she speaks Spanish and from the Bronx, Boricua, that's about as close to a black woman as you
And Jason, real quick, I'll tell you, when he named Elena Kagan, there was a lot of pressure put on civil rights groups to come out in support of her. Mark Morial was the only one that first week who would not accede to that. And in fact, we had Washington Watch, and we had people who were on the show that we taped it on a Friday. Valerie Jarrett was on our show that Friday. They put pressure on the NAACP and Reverend Sharpton to come out that weekend to endorse her. And I gave a speech, commencement speech at University of Maryland, University College, and we'd already taped the show. And I got a phone call when I got off that stage. Hey, we just got the NAACP's endorsement in Sharpton. Can we somehow squeeze into the show? I mean, so that was one of those deals where black pressure, got to them, and they were scrambling to get black folks to line up behind Elena Kagan. Well, 30 seconds.
Yeah, and it's questionable because Elena Kagan didn't have the greatest record of hiring or retention of black people in her position. But I think that's one of those things that the biggest complaint I've always had about Obama is power. He still left 100 judges on the table. There were recess appointments that he could have made. There was a recess appointment he could have made for the Supreme Court. He didn't do it. There was so much more he could have done in criminal justice.
He got slapped back for
the Supreme Court on the previous
on National
Labor Board. But that went to the Supreme Court, and they said he overreached on that, and so there was some hesitancy.
He could have done it, and he could have forced the issue.
But there was some hesitancy there because he'd already done that once.
Exactly.
Kickstart your day at 7 and get the news you need from the perspective you want. NewsOne Now with Roland Martin, every weekday morning at 7 on TV1.